So welcome to an Occupy talk. This is Linda Kaucher and Tom Lyons. They're here to talk about the US-EU trade agreement. This is something that promises to be a little bit scary for us. We don't know what it is exactly, and there's a lot of people, especially online, that aren't going to know what free trade agreements actually are. So we're going to start by an explanation on where they sit in the legal hierarchy, how they affect us, and Tom Lyons is going to start with that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, I'll do my best. Where should we begin? There's a free trade agreement, there's a trade agreement. Let's start with trade agreements. A trade agreement is just an agreement between two countries or sets of countries about how they're going to trade with each other and setting up certain rules, such as, for example, what import duties they will charge on this and that, or it can cover lots of things of that sort. The rules by which they will set up their common trade. Now, as such, there's nothing very remarkable in that, nothing exceptional at all.
Bilateral trade agreements need domestic legislation to give them legal effect in each signatory country. So first of all, I'm kind of curious as to what the domestic legislation is that gives it legal effect in this country. Then, where they create an inconsistency with pre-existing legislation, there are provisions in each country to decide how that's worked out. Also relevant here is the hierarchy of laws. So, for example, if a piece of new law is inconsistent with constitutional protected rights and responsibilities, the Constitution will prevail. But in terms of legislation with an equal footing, it's much more complex. So that's kind of what I thought you would explain how domestic legislation is allowing this to happen.
Well, yeah, I'd look at. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't really explain all those intricacies. I tend to look at it more politically and historically. The question I was looking for here was about mentioned the EU and saying, well, how do we get rid of all trade agreements? And I say, well, actually, the European Union is a trade agreement, among other things. What you hear other Tory anti-European saying is, well, all we wanted there was a trade agreement, so we can have free trade with the other European countries. And I actually argue in some of my work, I say there should be more trade agreements, for example, within Africa. They should be rather rationalised, but I believe in regional trade, sorting out trade between countries. I think the EU has actually been extremely successful in stimulating trade, in stimulating the development of countries which are at a similar economic level. And the same could work in Africa. Not forcing African countries into the international trading system where it's extremely difficult for them to compete, but let them to do trading with each other in similar types of goods and services. So there's nothing wrong with trade agreements as such. The question is what kind of agreements and who's behind them and what their purpose is. Would it help if I gave a little bit of history?
Probably.
That's my...
This is Occupy, so
yeah.
you're kind of supposed to go like this. It's one of those things. If you don't want it, you go like that.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you'll have heard of the terrible twins of the IMF and the World Bank, and the Bretton Woods Agreement, which created them in 1944, and they were started in 1945. Actually, Bretton Woods agreed to set up 3 organisations. The third one was going to be called the International Trade Organisation. And it was going to be a very different body from what 50 years later was created as the World Trade Organisation. It was going to do things like, for example, organise systems for stabilising commodity prices and give, a lot of monetary backing to that and so on. But, and this comes to your question, this is a treaty. All of these things, to set up these things, you have to sign treaties between countries. The treaty has to be ratified.
What's the domestic legislation that's allowing this particular treaty to be...
Well, the thing is that treaty was not ratified by the US Congress. So the US obviously was a major party to that treaty. A little bit like the Kyoto Agreement on climate change. The Americans refused to ratify that. Now the other countries then decided, okay, we'll try and go ahead without them. At the ITO it would have been absolutely impossible in the 1940s, just after the war. Without the Americans involved, complete waste of time. And then they set up, they kind of salvaged the bits and what they could of that, what they really wanted, which was actually a free trade agreement called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was an agreement between
1940s?
48, if I remember right, 47 or 48. And that was an agreement between the independent countries of the time, basically. It was a rich world thing, plus other countries had just become independent, like India. But obviously in the Western world. And it was meant to basically make trade, to get rid of tariffs or reduce the tariffs bit by bit on industrial goods in particular. But it did two things were excluded from it, typically. Agricultural trade, because every country at that time wanted to protect its agriculture for reasons of food security, and textiles, clothing and textiles, which historically is where industrialization nearly always starts. Most poor countries begin to industrialize in that sector, and they were prevented from doing so because they had to go through quotas and so on, which were temporary quotas which were set up in the 1950s, which then lasted for 50 years. Now, eventually in the 1980s, a lot of the corporations said, well, this isn't good enough, we want to protect our position in other ways. Like, for example, they invented this term, 30 years ago the term didn't exist, but you'll have heard of it, intellectual property. Ghastly, pompous phrase. It's another way of saying things like trademarks and patents and copyright. And there was the GATT was renegotiated every few years in what they called a trade round, and there's a new one coming up 30 years ago. And the American government under Reagan was persuaded to say, well, let's get beyond the GATT and introduce all sorts of things to broaden the agreement, including, for example, extending patent laws, making patent laws patents apply in one country also apply in another country, so you couldn't get counterfeiting and so on, which is another way that countries also managed to industrialise, by stealing other countries' patents, basically, and so on and so forth. And they had this long, very difficult round of negotiations. This is a typical thing about how this operates. This was all cooked up in a resort town in Uruguay called Punta del Este.
I'm going to have to speed you up there a little.
Yeah, okay. That's the secretiveness of it. So no one knew what they had in mind. And it wasn't publicised any more than this EU-US agreement has been publicised. Keep it quiet so that the ordinary people don't know what's going on. It's a technical thing dressed up in all sorts of very complex technical language, negotiated between specialists of the different countries. And each organisation, and in our case, Britain doesn't negotiate, the European Union does on our part, on behalf of all 27 EU countries. The US does obviously for itself. In each case, they have specialist teams which do the negotiation, and then they come back and you have to either ratify the whole thing or not at all. Which, and there are good reasons for that as well as bad ones. But the problem is that then it becomes very secretive. Now, then the WTO came along, a lot of developing countries were then persuaded before it started in 1995 to sign on the dotted line without really knowing what it was all about. And all sorts of arm twisting and things were done to bring them into the camp, and then once they'd signed it and got going, and they realised that they were stuffed by a lot of the provisions of the WTO. Hence, when the first round of renegotiations of the WTO came along in 2001, first lot in 1999 failed because of the massive demonstrations around the negotiating hall in Seattle. 2 years later, they sent it into Qatar, into Doha, where there couldn't be any demonstrators, and it was called the Doha Development Round, supposedly to deal with the developing countries' concerns first of all. No, it's been going for 12 years and it still hasn't reached anywhere near agreement, so yes, it has failed. In my opinion, the WTO itself has completely failed. World Trade Organization. It covers the GATT, the trade in services, intellectual property, investment, a whole range of different things. Finally, within the WTO, there's a provision for things called regional trade agreements, which supposedly are what they say, trade agreements within a particular region, like, for example, Europe. Because the WTO was failing 8 or 9 years ago, the US and the EU EU decided that they would forget about the WTO, it wasn't working for them, and instead set up pretend free trade agreements, but between one of them and regions of the world, which defeats the whole purpose, of course.
And these somehow are secret, these regional ones.
Well, they're all negotiated. No, well, those became very public.
The bilateral ones I've heard are like particular. Something about the bilateral ones. I believe you mentioned this, but something about bilateral is allowed to be not known. What's being discussed.
Well, Linda probably knows more about that than I do. But the EU-US one is the latest one, which is meant to. It's being got up in a tremendous hurry now. This is how I see it anyway. Interested to see what Linda thinks about it, because the US in particular sees that its position as the dominant country in the world is rapidly disappearing in the face of the expansion in the East, and so they want to lock in the position of their corporations, their and European ways of doing things, their ways of playing the game, to force the Asian countries to do it our way. Everything through private corporations, no state corporations, no state wealth funds or anything playing any part, for example, before the US because China becomes so powerful that it will be able to prevent that from happening.
Okay,
that's what's happening now.
Okay, so now we're going to hear a bit about the details of the EU-US, which is what we're all here for, thank you, Tom, and from Linda Kaucher. Thanks.
Hi. I'll make a few quick points just to get a few things straight. Trade, we probably would all think trade is a good thing generally. Trade and trade agreements are different things. Trade agreements is where neoliberalism gets set in stone irreversibly forever. That's the idea of trade agreements. If you're thinking, another point, if you're not clear on what Tom was saying, it was WTO until the Doha round was failing. In 2005, the EU switched to this program of bilaterals and regional trade agreements. So that's what we've got now. It's all bilateral trade agreements. An essential difference is they are secret. The text, the negotiations are secret until they're completed. Even though they're done on your behalf, you don't get to know what's in them until they're completed. Whereas if you remember the WTO, it was pretty high-profile protests. Trade deals are done state to state. They're negotiated state to state. Well, from our point of view, by the EU, which has the competency to do it, rather than member states. So they're state to state, but clearly they are done on behalf of corporations. So yes, they do. Corporations do have a really big say in policy. So they're done by transnational corporations for transnational corporations, and primarily the same old financial services are right in there, right up the front. And of course, from the EU point of view, that comes from here, the city, where the front group is the City UK. That's all one word, the City UK. That's the front word for the front group for transnational financial services. Don't ever think that the City of London or the City UK or financial services here are British in any sense. It's transnational financial services, happens to be parked here, and has a big say in EU trade policy. And EU trade policy is not EU because, for instance, the American Chamber of Commerce has a really big say in Brussels in EU trade policy. Getting this right. I'll talk about what's in trade agreements generally and then the difference with the US-EU one. In generally, trade agreements consist of trading goods, and that's what Cable tells you it's all about, trading goods, and trading services. Vince Cable, right. I'd also like to point out, before I go into goods and services, explain liberalisation, because this is the core thing of trade agreements and neoliberalism, really. And it gets tossed around a lot, liberalisation, but really explained. And it just means that you open investment opportunities to transnational corporations. And we've had a full-on liberalisation policy through since Thatcher, and the result in the private sector is that we don't own anything in this country, because every time anything is an investment opportunity, it's transnational corporations take it over. And in the private sector, it's the privatisation and the liberalisation at the same time, although it doesn't get talked about. So when there are public sector investment opportunities, whether it's PFIs or private or just contracting or sell-offs like water, they're always liberalised, they're always open to transnational corporations.
What's a PFI?
Private finance initiative, the way they built the hospitals.
One across the road, 115 million a year.
Yeah, the biggest
He's
in the
asking
country.
for everybody else.
Right, yeah, thanks. In trade agreements, you've got trading goods, trading services. They always put the trading goods in front of you, like it's going to make consumer goods cheaper, because liberalising trading goods means you reduce or eliminate at the border tariffs, import duties. So it can make goods cheaper for consumers. It certainly makes them cheaper for the transnational corporations. Most of our trade, though, is actually trade in services. About 70% of our trade, UK and EU, is trade in services. It doesn't get talked about so much. Liberalising trade in services is a really different ballgame. It's you open a service, you liberalise a service, so you commit the service to the trade agreement, which means you have opened it to transnational corporations, transnational investment, and you commit to keeping it open to transnational investment. And that gives those corporations rights when they come in, and limits your right to control those corporations. So that's what trade-in services in trade agreements is about. I know that can be a bit hard to get your head around if that's like the
May I
first
ask
time.
you to mention those two laws that will be invoked if this agreement goes through, the national something law and the one where they have to treat
That applies to all trading services. The trading service commitments always have national treatment, which means any transnational investor has to be treated as well as any domestic firm, including like subsidies. And the other one is market access. That means you can't limit how many firms come in that service sector or how many services they offer. So think financial services and different things they can offer, things they make up. So you can't limit them once you've opened that service. To come particularly, so that's what's in trade agreements generally, trading goods, trading services, as well as intellectual property that Thomas mentioned. In the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, though it has a different name in the US, just to make it more confusing.
What's that?
TAFTA, Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement. But
So it's the same thing. TTIP and TFTA is the same thing.
they're the same thing, yeah. So this is a really important agreement, not just for the size of it. I mean, you've got the size of the economies, the two biggest economies in the world in a trade agreement. But there's another element, and it's actually the biggest element of the trade agreement, is to harmonise the regulation between the EU and the US. Now that sounds kind of technical and boring, but if you think like as a country, it is our laws and our regulations that define our society. And we're this society, and the US is that society. And the main part of this agreement is to bring them together, to harmonise them. And of course, it's pointed out that the easiest harmonisation is with new regulation. It's harder to harmonise things that are established and different. But when there's new regulation coming in, it's easier to harmonise that, right? Now, this process has been going on for a while, even though this was only launched this year.
Would that be like the food standards, like how the food standards are different
It's
in America?
everything.
Yes, I'm
It's
sure it is.
everything. Yeah,
But,
you want to mention some things?
Yeah,
Yeah.
just to, you know.
Yeah.
Specifics,
yeah.
GMIs. And
So there's I'm not an expert on this, but the chemical standard in Europe is called REACH, that's the acronym, which is a good standard for chemicals. But that's at risk with lower standards from the US. GMO is a really big push you can expect on accepting genetically modified food, because that's been a stumbling block in trade for many years. So if that comes together, I mean, that push is happening on a lot of fronts already for the EU, which has resisted GM so far, to accept GM food. Chicken that's chlorinated, hormone beef, nice things like that. So you can see where the regulation coming together. The pharmaceutical industry is always big up the front on this stuff, so there's a lot of advantages in harmonising regulation there to make things easier across. You can count on the fact that harmonising regulation between the US and the EU will be a downward spiral of regulation. It will be corporate friendly, especially as it's being done in secrecy. It would just be a downward spiral. Another aspect particular to this trade agreement is that the stated aim is to establish these rules and for them to become the global rules. So what was not achieved in the WTO, because in the context of the WTO, the developing countries were able to team up and resist this corporate agenda, but with this EU-US neoliberal agenda, it's a way of establishing global rules that finally slips back to the WTO and becomes the multilateral rules, but it's coming from that US-EU perspective, particularly the US perspective. An important element in this is, whereas there was a question about how this stuff is imposed, how it becomes permanent. Well, in the context of the WTO, you get these disputes which are state to state. If someone's not keeping to what they're committed to, there's another country raises a dispute, and as you see, it's a state to state process. But introduced into this US free trade agreement is investor-state dispute settlement, which allows corporations to sue governments like ours directly for anything that, any government action that limits their future profits. Now you can imagine the most likely thing that will limit corporations' future profits will be the sort of regulation that we want to see introduced, environmental, social, labour stuff.
May I ask a question here? Because that's so scary, and that's kind of like a catchphrase that has us all going, ooh, you know, it's the movie land. It's just so scary. I kind of wonder, like, if everything is being done in secret, what makes you know this?
The commission, it's the Trade Commission that does the negotiating, and the process of getting its mandate is it writes its own mandate, it goes to the Council, which is the governments joined together, and then it goes to the European Parliament, so they say yes, it comes back to the Commission, and then the Trade Commission has got its mandate to negotiate, which it wrote itself in the first place, and that's been leaked. Right, so there's
sorry, could you say that again? Because I was writing it down. I really missed it. Sorry.
So the process is that the Trade Commission writes its own mandate to negotiate, and that goes to the Council, which you know is the
Council of
the EU Council,
EU Council,
right?
Okay.
Which is the member state representatives.
Yes.
So they say yes to it, and then it goes to the European Parliament, which doesn't have that much power, but has to say yes to it, and then it comes back and
through the Trade Commission.
Yes, so then the Trade Commission has got its mandate to negotiate, which it wrote itself in the first place.
And we've learned quite a lot about the Trade Commission from the film The Brussels Business, right? That's the one that...
Oh, yeah, you've seen that. Yeah,
yes,
it's good,
so
isn't it?
the
Yeah.
Brussels Business shows us that the Trade Commission is very influenced by lobbyists, and it's a wonderful film. I think it costs about £5 to watch it. It's still something you need to pay online to see. I highly recommend it.
What's it called?
It backs up everything that's
The Brussels.
Brussels business. It's a very slick, informative film about the Trade Commission of Europe.
But also you find out from the grassroots people. I mean, there's one example in Canada where they were fighting asbestos or something. It was against the environmental law, and the multinationals sued the government, the Canadian government.
There's floor space.
Because the local people were fighting this being built in their area.
Right.
This has been, this investor-state dispute settlement, this ability for corporations to sue governments, has been in other trade agreements already. So we know what it does. It's in NAFTA, for instance, the North American Free Trade Agreement.
ISDI, is that the one?
ISDS.
ISDS.
Investor-state dispute settlement.
Investor-state dispute settlement.
And the effects of it are either big payouts, and that's happening all the time, or it just chills legislation, so governments get frightened to legislate because they're going to be sued. Well, they don't know if they're going to be sued, or they don't know if they're going to be sued for how much. And you can imagine governments like we have would be more than happy to have it chilled on legislation. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. So what's particular about this trade agreement, apart from trading goods, trading services, is the central part of it is this regulatory harmonisation, and that it's creating, from that it's creating these global rules which will be global. That's the intention of it. Although this is a transatlantic deal, anyone else can join in if they want to, if they're prepared to play by the rules. Any other country can join in, transatlantic or not. There's been a Canadian-EU trade agreement negotiated for about 5 years. It's just been sort of kind of signed up, but no one's saying what's in it, so very strange situation. But you can see that the Canada one is an entree for the US one. And it was mentioned, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I think you need this picture. There's also this Trans-Pacific Partnership that's been negotiated for a few years, so it's further down the track. So you can see who's in the middle there, the US with this transatlantic one and the Trans-Pacific one. So that's most of the world sewn up in those two agreements, yeah. Public procurement is a big part of the global trade agenda. And by public procurement, I mean all government spending, public services plus. And what they seek, what transnational corporations seek in regard to public procurement is not just access to government spending, but rights to access government spending, rights in these international trade treaties. What that means, rights to access for transnationals to access government spending, is that it cuts out any localization. It cuts out any. They're going to swallow up domestic firms for sure, or they're going to get contracts in front of domestic firms. But those you can't have public money being spent to create jobs in your area or even your country. What if transnationals have the rights to bid for the public procurement contracts? It works dead against that any of that sort of like using public money for local stimulus in any way. But I don't just mean locally; it's nationally as well that it cuts out.
Now you.
Okay.
15 minutes.
So public procurement, that's where the NHS comes in. The NHS, like I say, this trade agreement was launched in February. But actually David Cameron announced it on the first day of the year because he was so full of himself that he was going to be chairing the G8 when it was going to be launched. So it's actually been in train for a long time. So that regulatory harmonisation's been going on for a long time. And what's one thing that's been produced in this time is the Health and Social Care Act, which has obviously been harmonised in preparation with, it's been harmonised with the US already. So you've got it harmonised in the context of this trade agreement, even though not formally launched. Then you get national legislation. So you can't say it's the trade agreement. And the difference that the trade agreement makes down the track is that it will make it irreversible. So whatever disasters come from the Health and Social Care Act, you can't reverse it, right? Because you have liberalised. You haven't just made that contract with that firm, you've liberalised it so it stays open to transnational investors. That's where that permanence comes in.
Even
And there's going to be lots of
changing
questions.
governments?
Okay.
Yeah.
So if I can just say that that for me, I've been looking at this stuff right back since the Seattle stuff, really, and I think it all runs on very strongly on secrecy, and when they can't keep it secret anymore, they just spin it and tell you how good it all is, and then they wrap it up in technical language and put those together, and that's enough to put the media right off, so you never get any information about it. Can I just talk about the tobacco stuff? Right. If you think this is
Oh, can I read some concrete examples?
It's a good story.
From
Yeah.
tobacco.
if you think this is like pretty far away and remote stuff, the tobacco plain packaging that Cameron reneged on, even though it was committed in the Queen's speech, it was treated by the media here as a national issue, and the only question was whether Lyndon Crosby, the Tory advisor who does actually work for Philip Morris International, whether he had talked to Cameron about it. Yeah, that is a question, but this is an international issue because Australia enacted this plain packaging legislation right back from last December. Before it was enacted, it was taken to court, to the Australian High Court, by two big tobacco companies and backed by Philip Morris. And the High Court judged in favour of the Australian government and the legislation. 5 hours later, the Ukraine government raised a dispute at the WTO, because this is a trade issue, it's an intellectual property issue, raised a dispute against Australia at the WTO, not because it has any tobacco business with Australia, which it doesn't, but it does have a Philip Morris subsidiary in the Ukraine. So that is a case really worth watching, because that is such an example of where free trade comes head to head with public health legislation. Now, to bring that back here, you can see that whoever jogged Cameron's elbow, there's no way that he, with such a free trade liberalised country as this, and promoting the US free trade agreement as he is, there's no way that he could have actually enacted that legislation, which would have in fact been backing Australia in that case, and pro-public health and against free trade. Well, I mean, you can't do that here. So there's no way that he actually could have. So you can, and that, I think that shows you how the trade agenda out there is the reference point for all national legislation. Okay.
Okay, so I'd like to back up what she said about the what Linda said. Sorry, about the how they spin it. Because if you go to the EU site, it makes trade agreements sound great. Really does. There's videos, there's talks. It makes them sound like they wouldn't dream of lowering the standards of human rights. In fact, that's what makes it most complicated. And I, for one, who am like a media maker, I kind of, sort of watch it and think, well, why are we so focused that they are going to do a bad thing? Like, why can't we believe that maybe they might do the right thing? Why are we so convinced? Like, the left is always thinking, like, the worst is going to happen, by now we're supposed to have a different monetary system. By now we're supposed to have a different monetary system. Capitalism is supposed to have been, buried according to what we all said in 2008. So what makes you so certain that, like, human rights and environment are going to be going down the toilet with this EU-US agreement?
They actually do make sure they've got a sustainable development chapter.
It's to combat. If people watch this, they're going to go to the EU site.
Yeah.
They're going to see much slicker video with much better, language, with a much better facilitator.
Right. Why else would they keep it secret? I think that says it all, really. Yeah.
There's another answer. If you want a specific catalogue, this thing which came out last week by the head of War and Want contains example after example of how trade agreements have been used to sort of make impotent national legislatures. I mean, the first example here is Vattenfall. When the Germans decided that they were going to phase out nuclear, the Swedish power providers said, hey, even though we've not got our secondary agreement, we will ultimately lose money on that, therefore we will sue you for about 3.1 billion. And they went in to have private little talks, the results of which weren't publicised, but it was said to be very satisfactory to Vattenfall. And there's one example after another in this book, and I'm sure you can find them elsewhere, but we'll do the list later maybe.
Okay, so that book is called
The Poverty of Capitalism, John Hillary.
The Poverty of Capitalism, by John Hillary. So, Melanie,
Thanks. I've got two parts to my question.
who is it directed to, please?
Linda. So, in terms of the NHS being included in the free trade agreement, are there any limitations as to, because at the moment I just know that it's included and it's up for grabs. I just wanted to know whether there are any parameters to that in the agreement as it stands at the moment. And secondly, has there been any response by the government to pressure, for example, the petition to exempt the NHS from the free trade agreement?
I have to say I haven't followed the petition, but I think we would have seen it if there was any response, because they have an option, don't they? They don't have to take any notes, petitions. Back in May, Lord Green, who's one of the trade ministers, actually just lied straight out to the BMA, and the British Medical Association was so keen to put themselves out there and say, look what we did. They got a press release out straight away saying, look what we did, and they've just been lied to. The thing with public services is that the language around them is always vague. So whether it's in the WTO GATS or the Bolkenstein stuff or that's the internal stuff, or in the Lisbon Treaty, it's gradually got weaker. So for instance, nobody actually calls it public services. The language has got weaker. Generally the idea is that the only chance of them being exempt is if they're totally public with no private involvement, so there goes the NHS, no exemption there at all. There certainly is no exemption in this free trade agreement, and even the French stuff that got talked about when they were hassling for the cultural exemption, they didn't actually get an exemption, they got an exception. So a little pat on the head of like, we'll treat it specially and we'll talk about it later. They did not get an exemption, and certainly no exemption for the NHS or public services generally. When it's come down to the Lisbon Treaty, the language of the Lisbon Treaty, the language has got really weak and tricky because it's come down to services of general interest, divided between services of, now listen to this one, services of general economic interest and non-economic services of general interest. And the health is in services of general economic interest, which means it's a money thing. So that's how it's got weak. That's how it's got weaker and weaker. The idea of public services or some protection. So a very hard fight, a fight that's got to be had, I think, to call for an exemption of the NHS. Obviously, there's heaps of other stuff in the trade agreement and the trade agreement itself that we don't want. But I think that calling for the exemption of the NHS, because public procurement is such a big prize in itself, because the NHS is so important to us, because there's such good mobilisation and networking across the country for that here, I think to call for an exemption of the NHS hits at the heart of the whole thing. And some people say, oh, this complication, that complication, we don't know the details and how it can be done. That's not our job. Our job is just to say, we want it out of this trade agreement, and then it's for bureaucrats and politicians to work out how and the technicalities. It's not up to us to know whether it's technically possible, just that we want it. That's why I think that an exemption is well worth pursuing.
Sorry, I don't know if I missed it. So which one would the NHS fall under in this very, difficult service?
Services of general economic interest.
Services of general economic interest is what we need to kind of point our literature towards, if we want to be understood by them or something.
It's not. I don't think it's for us to make ourselves understandable. They work for us.
Okay.
Services of general economic interest means it's a money deal.
Yeah.
The other one, non-economic services of general interest, is outside of a money deal, something that no one's interested in investing in. Not much of that, but that's the bit that would be exempt.
So would that go along with Tanya's question, which is, I'm worried that private prison and school facilities may be taken over by firms from the US with throwback ideas on how to treat children and young people. Let's just give Tom a bit of a chance to maybe talk about that.
Well, that's happening already anyway.
Just nationally, yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot more to it than simply who owns the prisons and schools and so on, and who's running them. It's also a culture. One thing which I've noticed is that whenever there's any discussion about, new ways of doing any kind of social policy or penal policy or almost anything, what are the examples that the media and the politicians talk about? They're always American. Hardly ever. The only occasional time is when Michael Gove talks about free schools in Sweden, which is a neoliberal experiment that they've had in there, thinking, oh well, that will get people excited because Sweden is supposed to be very liberal and social democratic and everything. Well, this is a bit of it that isn't. Whereas if you think about it, in almost every area of public life, the European traditions, the West European traditions, are far superior to the American ones. And it should be to France and Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands and Sweden and Switzerland and many other countries in Europe that we should be going for examples, and not to the Americans. Because the Americans get, well, we know what their prisons are like, we know what their judicial systems are like, we know how bad their schools are, we know how bad the health system is, and so on.
Yes, good point. We've got questions. I believe I saw yours first. I don't know how long you were up for, Rebecca, sorry.
Right, two things. If you are going to mention Lord Green, do not be so polite about it. He is Stephen Green, who was the CEO of HSBC at the time of money laundering for the Mexican and Colombian drug cartels, and obviously knew nothing about it. He's now a Tory peer, and he is a Church of England vicar. So that's the first point. Second point is...
Hold the microphone a bit further away.
Second point is, very simply, that the press, government and everybody else will carry on telling us how complicated this is and that we won't understand it and we can't have a proper debate for an election. In 1975, now David, you've heard this so you can close your ears. In 1975 we had a referendum on the EU, or Common Market as it was called then. My mother came from Scotland, and I had an aunt in Scotland that came down every year in June for a week. And she came down on a cheap fare, and so she went to vote first because she believed voting was sacrosanct. And so in the evening somebody said, Auntie Mary, how did you vote? She said, well, I voted no because if all the big businesses for it, all the politicians are for it, and all the newspapers are for it, it can be nay good for the working man. And so I think the thing everybody needs to remember is you don't need to know fuck all about the detail of it, right? Just look who's in favour of it and you know where you stand. Thank you.
Excellent. Yes. Definitely very much. The question over there?
Hi, yeah, so there was mentioned a few minutes ago that the idea is that the EU and America, it's kind of mutually beneficial that they enter into an agreement in terms of controlling world economics and the rise of the East and things. So if we are successful in stopping this going through, then what is the alternative to the rise of the East and then coming over and just forcing their way of things on us instead? I mean, what would happen if this didn't?
Yeah. So if we weren't in a relationship with the US, we would probably end up in a relationship with other...
Yeah, I was worried about that, you know, that seems pretty scary, equally scary, you know.
Okay, do you have something specific to say about that?
I do.
Okay.
Okay. You can worry about China or whatever, or you can worry about multimillionaires around the world, and I would suggest that the latter is the bigger threat. Why did the World Trade Organization fail in the first place? And we're doing this sort of bilateral agreement, basically because the less powerful but coming up countries could sort of see the capitalisation agenda, particularly from the old rich countries, and they, again with the protesters in Seattle and so on, demonstrated against it and lobbied against it, and it got dropped. And again, let's remember that in the past legislation has been put to the EU with a lot of corporate lobbying, and although the EU is pretty much captured by corporate lobbying at the moment, it hasn't always been so. I mean, remember the hours legislation that the Brits fought against. So, I mean, the issue is really, who do we ally with? Do we ally with the rich internationally, or do we seek international agreements which improve the lives of the 99%, the people at the bottom? Because where I think I disagree with Linda is, if we try and stand as individual countries economically, we will be picked off by big capital anyway. It's called regulatory arbitrage, and therefore we need some harmony, we need some agreements between countries. We just don't want them given to us by the people who have got, you know, most of the money, and so on and so forth. And there's a little bit more leverage with these other countries, but yeah, I mean, we need to defend our workers, they need to defend their workers, and it's a complex lobbying process as far as I can judge.
The stuff we've been describing tonight is taking us towards a corporate-run world.
Okay.
Right, that's really where we're going. That sounds so dramatic, but that is actually where we're going. And I mean, if you look around, we're a lot of the way there already. But this is so many rights in international law to corporations. It's actually a corporate-run world.
In fact, it's even worse than that, because Mussolini described the coming together of state and corporate power as corporatism. We actually know it as fascism. What we have is not neoliberalism, it's fascism light. And things like the gagging, things like the freedom to protest are all part of tightening up the personal laws so that we can proceed with fascism. And a very main part of the EU is the movement of labour, and put the word cheap in before the word labour. It's always been for capitalism to move the poor to an area where they can undercut the wage levels. And that is the reality. We are dealing with the reinvention of fascism under the neoliberal banner.
So we need international agreements to defend ourselves from that, rather than to make us submit more rapidly, which is where we're going right now.
I don't agree with you, but I won't take up time saying why.
On this question of China, I mean, the gentleman raised a very real concern. My answer is we will have to deal with that when we come to it. It will have to. Well, we don't know what, in what way they would want to change things. I'm sure they will, just as the Americans, when they became dominant after 1945, recreated the world in their image, just as this country created the world in its image before that. China, if it does become dominant, will want to recreate things in its image, but we don't know what it will want to do, how it will want to do it. But it will just be, we will have to resist it and find allies around the world to help us in that task. And what we should stand up on, as now, is democracy. Say, no, this is our country. We want to run it our way, not the way the Americans or the Europe or the EU, the European Commission or the government in Beijing or anywhere else tells us to.
What moves can a motley crew like this do?
I don't know, I suppose I'm by nature more of a researcher and analyst than a campaigner, but I mean, basically make as much of a noise as you can.
We need more direction than that.
Yeah, well, maybe Linda has a clearer idea, or David. get involved in any campaign, set up petitions, write to MPs, write to MEPs, raise it, write letters to the press. If you write blogs, send it around. Organise meetings like this wherever you can with any interested parties, whether it's with the NHS or with GMO campaigns or any other things which are under threat like this. Likewise on banking issues, financial regulation is also a big issue here. Basically kick up a stink in such a way that, as with, for example, the fracking protest in Balcombe, the press and the BBC have to sit up and listen and tell the rest of the country what's going on. At the moment, they don't feel that way, so they're keeping very quiet about it.
Okay, someone said in Brussels last week, talking about, do you remember the MAI, Multilateral Agreement on Investment? Right, I mean, it seemed like a success at the time, but of course all those things have come back in trade agreements. But someone said about that it was like Dracula. When you shone light on it, when people knew about it, it was just a no-brainer that you were against it. And obviously what's missing on this thing is to crack through the secrecy. So that's what I do, is to try and tell people about it. But we need a lot more people talking about it, so it becomes current currency, that general currency, that people know this trade agreement's out there. The NHS has been could have been a more useful vehicle, but it's been a useful vehicle for that because, like, I've been battling with this trade stuff for years, and everyone thinks it's really boring. But when you talk about the NHS in relation to it, then people can grasp it quite easily. They know what they stand to lose. So Unite Union is, and that's the biggest union in the country, is getting pretty active on this trade agreement. It started with a focus on the NHS, but they're looking more broadly, especially at labour issues and stuff like that. So that's really useful. I think a one-off meeting like this is a start, but I think Occupy needs an ongoing group on this trade agreement.
Yes,
Yeah?
Occupy. Just dump it on Occupy. Hey, Occupy, just do it, man. Like, you know, like we're like 1,000 million people or something. We're just like a tiny.
Whether it's one of the existing groups taking it on as a main focus, or a group particularly on this, and I'll be glad to be in it as well. But what I'm saying is, Unite's out there doing it. That's a pretty good connection to make, for one thing, with resources, etc., etc. Focus. I gave the reasons why I think focusing on the exemption of the NHS makes us look like we know what you're up to. We know what we're talking about. We know what we want. So I think that's a really good, real focus, narrow focus for it. This sort of shining light on it. I'm sure that you're not exactly in favour of this trade agreement just after this 2 hours, and that's the way other people would be as well. It's just the knowing about it. That's the important thing at this stage. Yeah.
Still, yes.
Just a quick question. What's our time frame to win?
Oh yeah, how long?
Okay. They're aiming to do this super fast, like the end of next year. Well, you know, I mean, this is massive, and trade agreements usually take 5 years, and then a lot of them fall to bits at that stage anyway. So it's really ambitious that they're trying to do it. But don't think it's all like clearly defined and by the book. Brussels gets away with what Brussels can get away with, and that's in direct relation to how much secrecy. They can get away with a lot if it's secret. So, for instance, the Canada one was kind of, there's a lot of issues not sorted out in the Canada one, and but they just signed it up in principle 2 weeks ago, even though there's lots of issues not sorted out, and they haven't put the text out, so no one still knows what's in it, but it's signed up. So because they needed to see something signed up, they've signed it up in principle. They'll just get away with anything.
Steve is one of our main researchers, Steve Rushton.
With the British Bankers Association, it's obviously a good one to target for the banking. Is there a similar lobbying group or lobbying groups for the for the that try and take over the NHS. I know there's a lot of different organisations like Circle and all the different healthcare providers, but are there other groups that we can target that kind of like are kingpins in this, like the British Bankers is for all the banking regulation?
Well, there are a lot of them. For different, they're mainly set up on industrial sectors. So you've got the pharmaceutical people, for example. You've got the organisation, agricultural organisation. Interesting, watch how they go. The Farmers' Lobby, which is very well organised in Brussels, and with the NFU, which is not what it claims to be. It really only represents the big farmers of this country. And also, in the past, it's had companies like Tesco as members of it. So the NFU is not what it pretends to be. It does not represent agriculture as a whole in this country, and therefore they have to be watched very carefully. And similarly, all other sectors are organised in some way or other. Linda may know more than I do about specific ones, if you want to add anything.
Well, there's the City UK here. Amazingly low profile for what it is. It was formed
Deliberately, no doubt.
It was formed in 2010 from the lobbying organisation for a decade had been International Financial Services London, IFSL, and the City of London Corporation. So they joined up in 2010 for the City UK front group. The problem for the City of London Corporation is that half of its function is a local authority. I'm sure a lot of you read the Griffin chapter, have you, in Nick Shaxton's book, really worth reading. The Treasure Islands book about tax havens, one standalone chapter about Griffin. It really gives you the lowdown on the City of London. Not its trade function, but it's really essential knowledge. So they formed this, the City of London Corporation has got a dual function. It's there for all the big financial services, but it's also a local government authority. So you're a bit iffy when you come to freedom of information. So because in its local authority thing, it's subject to freedom of information. So to get right out of that, they joined up with IFSL, which was the lobby group anyway for financial services, and formed the City UK, all one word. At that time, there was a third partner. Now, this is interesting. On the website, there was a third partner. UK Trade and Industry, part of a government department, right? Part of a department that straddles BIS, Business and Development. And I asked questions about that, and suddenly it wasn't a partner anymore.
Yay.
So that was government and business joined at the hip in that lobbying organisation, right? So UKTI is not in there anymore, but you can see quite a lot on the, I mean, obviously you have to be a member to get to the media and stuff like that, but the City UK is the key organisation, but ridiculously low key in this country considering it's running the country.
I'd like to thank Tom Lyons, who's been government policy guy, 50 countries, amazing man, and Linda, who's just taken this work on herself as an activist, although I don't know if she knows that. You are an activist, you know that, eh?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And there's all different sorts of activism, of course. There's the stuff in your house, in your office, on your street, in your shops. It's just talk, on comments. It's not just online, it's not just protesting. It's all over. It's an idea and it's just got to be spread. Thank you very much.
It's in a chocolate fingers container.
Pass it along.